For a lot of teams in the NFL, having a 10-7 record in consecutive seasons while winning your division and having a playoff win by 20 or more points, the national viewpoint and viewpoint about a team in general with those accolades would be that that's a team that's on their way to becoming a Super Bowl contender, and they are on the rise within the realm of the NFL. However, it seems like for the Houston Texans, that viewpoint is not really had by many people in the national media. And it seems like a lot of people think that there was a regression in year two from CJ Stroud and the offense as a whole. And for that reason, this isn't a team that should be in contention for Super Bowl talks or isn't really even thought about as much compared to the other teams even in their own division. I think a lot of people talk about the Indianapolis Colts, what they could possibly be, the Jacksonville Jaguars, what they could possibly be, even with all the talk about Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans after this offseason. It seems like the Houston Texans are somehow the fourth most talked about team in their division when for the last 2 years they've been the number one team in their division. Now, going to the seemingly regression-based year for CJ Stroud in year two. Now, statistically, I can't really say anything that would really change your mind as to whether that regression actually happened. Now, that's statistically speaking. You know, passing completion-wise, they between 2023 and 2024, they were pretty similar. But other than that, the yards were down, the touchdowns were down, the interceptions were up. And so, like I said, statistically, that claim can be had, and that claim makes sense. However, you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt, because between Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell last year, the wide receiver core, just with those three guys, missed 21 games, 4 playoff games, and they were the 3 top targets for CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans offense. Now, Nico Collins is probably the most important of those 3. It seemed like he was kind of blossoming into a top 5 possible receiver in the NFL. He was leading the NFL in receiving yards, yards per catch, I believe, touchdowns. He was in the top 3 of the league, I believe, as well. And then he goes down with a hamstring injury, and that kind of derailed his ascension into that possible best wide receiver in the league conversation, even though he still ended the year having his career best season in terms of catches, receiving yards, touchdowns. It was his best year even with that injury. Now, the passing game, even though they had their struggles, the running game had a bit of an improvement last year. Even though the yards per attempt were not increased, the volume that Joe Mixon was able to produce on his own, it kind of matched what the running backs in 2023 did as a whole. I mean, receiving-wise, he was basically as productive. In terms of putting the ball in the end zone, he doubled the production of the 2023 running backs. And that's a massive viewpoint and topic for this team because it was a bad year for Dameon Pierce last year. It's kind of been a bad couple of years for Dameon Pierce after 2022 when he kind of broke out as one of the better young running backs in the NFL. Defensively, this was a team that was led by, 5 stars on this squad. Between Kalen Bullock, Kamari Lassiter, and Derek Stingley, this secondary, just with those 3 players, had 13 interceptions. Kalen Bullock and Kamari Lassiter were top 10 in Defensive Rookie of the Year voting. Derek Stingley was the first-team All-Pro cornerback. And then you have 2 solid years out of Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson. 23 sacks between the 2 of them. They got after the quarterback very well. You also got a really good year out of second-year linebacker Henry To'o. Nothing spectacular, but especially in those weeks where Azeez Al-Shire was out for his suspension on the hit to Trevor Lawrence, Henry To'o stepped up and was the leader and was the, guy in the middle that this team needed to still be a successful unit. Now, encapsulating 2024 as a whole for the Houston Texans, it's kind of weird to see it, but this was a team that had a 0-point differential in 2024, even though they were a team that won 10 games. You really don't see that very often where they allow as many points as they scored. The only team that was a playoff team in 2024 that had a worse point differential was the LA Rams. And there was a thought about this team through the year, and it was pretty warranted that this wasn't a team that could beat the good teams in the NFL, much less the great teams. You have losses, big time losses against like the Minnesota Vikings or the Baltimore Ravens or the Kansas City Chiefs. And then you have the stinker losses in there as well, like the Jets on Thursday Night Football. You lose to the Tennessee Titans. And then you also have a loss against the Detroit Lions where even though it wasn't a big loss, it was only by 3 points, it was a game that they easily should have won, and they had won all the way up until the last few minutes of the fourth quarter. Now, this is a team who went through a pretty big transition period on their depth chart through free agency this year. On the offensive line, they add 3 guys who possibly could be starters, if not just good depth pieces. Between Cam Robinson, Trent Brown, and Laken Tomlinson, 3 guys who possibly, like I said, could be starters in this year. You also add guys on the defense that I think address kind of the main issue with the pass rush, is that it was kind of just Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter last year. You get Sheldon Rankins, who, when he was a Texan a few years ago, was one of the better interior defensive tackles in the NFL. You get Darrell Taylor, who can possibly be a second, third down, the obvious passing situations. He can be a guy you put on the outside of either Danielle Hunter or Will Anderson, and that's speed and power coming off the edge that can't really be matched between either of those combinations. There are some losses for this team through free agency as well, but not really many guys that you can say played a major piece or played a major role for this team last year. Stephon Diggs does leave, and it was a pretty big acquisition for Houston in the offseason of 2024, but he didn't really have much go on throughout 2024 in the regular season. Eric Murray is probably the biggest loss. He played a lot of football for this team. He played in the playoffs a lot for this team. But that's really it. I mean, other than that, it's just some vets like Case Keenum and Robert Woods that are leaving. But nothing on this list of guys that left makes you think that this team got worse through free agency at all. The Texans did trade away a few players, however. They do trade away Kenyon Green and Laramie Tunsil, 2 players who have started a lot of games on the offensive line, especially Laramie Tunsil, considered one of the best left tackles in the NFL. But at the same time, Laramie Tunsil has had a lot of pre-snap penalty and false start issues in the past. So I don't think it's really a major deal that they lost Laramie Tunsil. They got a lot of draft capital in 2026 out of Laramie Tunsil. They also got the rights to draft Jalen Noel in the 3rd round this year. Houston also acquires Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Ed Ingram through trades this year. And, it's, again, guys who can play on this team. Ed Ingram has had some issues in the past with, I think, in the run, he hasn't had the best time. But, he's replacing Kenyon Green, who really didn't get off to a good start with the Houston Texans. He was a highly drafted player at a college, but never really got going and never really made that value worth it. And with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, I mean, honestly, like I said, we basically traded Kenyon Green for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. So it's like we could cut Chauncey Gardner-Johnson tomorrow, and I'm not really seeing much of a difference for this team. I mentioned Jalen Noel, drafting him in the 3rd round this year for the Houston Texans. The Texans made a pretty conceited effort to make sure that they have plenty of depth on the offense, namely at receiver. They also get Woody Marks in the 4th round out of USC. But you add 2 receivers, you add a running back, you add an offensive lineman as well, and Ariante Ursary from Minnesota. Whether he ends up playing at tackle or inside at guard, it's more depth, and you just hope that you're adding more talent to that group. That was still probably the worst, if not the worst, one of the worst groups the offensive line was in the entire NFL. They were 30th in sacks allowed this last year. I think they were tied for 15th in terms of rushing yards. And with a guy like Joe Mixon in your backfield, being 15th, you got to get a better offensive line. With a guy like CJ Stroud being tied for 30th in sacks allowed, you got to be better. And that's why I think you saw such a big, this was a big transition going from a group that's highlighted by Laramie Tunsil and some other really good players. They said goodbye to those guys, and they're bringing in new faces to try to make this a better squad up front. And you can't fault them for making that attempt at all. Looking at what this depth chart for the Houston Texans looks like in 2025, you have some pretty big names on this offense. Nico Collins is going to be one of the better receivers in the NFL again. This is a team led by CJ Stroud, who we hope 2024 was just kind of a blip on the radar, and we see more of what we saw in 2023. But you also hope younger guys on this team, like, honestly, Dameon Pierce is still young enough to make an impact enough to want to keep him around long term. Woody Marks, if we see something good out of him this year, along with Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb. But it's also this offensive line. Blake Fisher, this is his first year coming into the year as the starting right tackle. Titus Howard is going to get moved back into guard, where it seems like between his time at right or left guard and right tackle, inside at guard has kind of been where he has succeeded the most. And then you have Laken Tomlinson and Cam Robinson starting on your left side. You also have the addition of Christian Kirk, which I don't think I mentioned yet. You trade for him from Jacksonville. And between Kirk, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, John Mechie, and if you get really good production out of Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel, you have between your wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs a really talented skill group that if they make it even easier on CJ Stroud, then this offense is just going to take off. Defensively is where this is going to be a team looking pretty similar to where they were last year for the starters. It's going to be Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter, and then their outstanding secondary. CJ Gardner-Johnson is probably starting this year. Whether or not that's going to be good for the Texans, I'm not sure yet. I think I just want to see increased production from Kalen Bullock and Kamari Lassiter, as well as just more out of Jalen Petrie. He's had really good years. He's had moments in those years where he hasn't looked great. But I think overall, Jalen Petrie has been a pretty good player for the Texans. And the hope is that he just continues to improve. The second and third string guys is really where you're going to see a lot of the new faces, like Sheldon Rankins, like Darrell Taylor, like EJ Speed and Nick Neiman. And honestly, those guys, I think that was kind of one of the main issues with the defense last year is, once we saw, if Derek Stingley needed a break, if Azeez Al-Shire or Henry To'oTo'o needed some rest, or if anyone on the D line needed some rest, there really wasn't guys behind them that could even match 75% to 50% of what either of those guys brought. And now adding those guys to your depth, it's just making them even better. Now, on to the schedule and how good or bad this could be for the Houston Texans this year. Now, there's a lot to kind of look at here and digest. I think these first 5 weeks are going to be pretty tough for the Texans. You have the LA Rams, you have the Baltimore Ravens, and Jacksonville Jaguars in the first 5 weeks. Now, even though Jacksonville and Tennessee, you don't look at them as major players in the NFL this year. They were two teams who were picking at the top of the draft this year, but they're also two teams who underwent a major change. Tennessee got, hopefully, their franchise quarterback. Jacksonville got, hopefully, their head coach that can bring their franchise quarterback to, higher heights than he's had so far. But you also have Tampa Bay, Seattle, and then a 3-week stretch against San Francisco, Denver, and Jacksonville. All 3 games at home, but all 3 games against tough opponents. You still have some easier games in there. I think Jacksonville, even though that's 2 games against a team who like I said, went through a major change with their head coaching position. I think Houston's still better than them. I think Houston's still better twice a year than Tennessee. It's those games where Buffalo, Kansas City, even the LA Chargers, even Denver to an extent. These are the games where it's really going to be major for Houston to get one or two of these games against playoff caliber teams. Because, like I mentioned in the beginning, that was kind of the reason a lot of people were turned off by the Houston Texans, is they couldn't beat teams that people thought were either up to the same talent level or more talented or better than them. Houston always crumbled at the end, or they got beat by a blowout. They never seemed competitive enough to be winning against the teams that people thought were better than them. In terms of a floor for this team, I think 9-8 is probably where they slot in at there. You know, they're still going to be at the top of the AFC South, I believe. They're still going to be a team that's fighting to get some sort of home field advantage, whether it's the 3 or 4 seed. Ceiling-wise for this team, if everything goes right, if CJ Stroud is back to how he looked in 2023, if the offensive line is even, 50% better than they were last year, they're going to see major improvements offensively. And I think this team can win 12 or 13 games. I really do. They're talented enough to do it. It's just whether or not they can kind of stay out of their own way on some of these major moments of games where it seemed like last year, like I said, they just kept on faltering towards the end of games where they should have won them. Overall, the Houston Texans have a really good team. And this should hopefully be the year where they're not going to be pushing for a Super Bowl. I wouldn't go that far yet. But they have a team that can push those Super Bowl contenders like Baltimore, like Buffalo, and like Kansas City. If they see them in the playoffs, and even though Houston put up a good fight against the Kansas City Chiefs last year, no one at any point thought the Houston Texans were beating Kansas City in the playoffs last year. And even if they did, there was no thought at all that they would have had a chance against either Buffalo or Baltimore. The hope is that at the end of this year, that mindset is different about the Houston Texans. There's a thought that they're now the 4th team in the AFC that's pushing for Super Bowl runs, along with Baltimore, along with Kansas City and Buffalo. Not that they're the afterthought after any of those teams. To me, that's what I would hope for as a fan of the Houston Texans.